Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Anne and today I'm doing a very exciting video. This might be my favorite video of the year and it's my top 10 favorite books of 2020. Although 2020 has been a shit show of a year, it's been a very good reading year for me, both in terms of quality and quantity. I read 75 books this year, which is way more than I usually read. I think the most I've read so far is 50 books. Maybe 52. So that's a very big increase in the amount of books I've read, and I've also liked pretty much all of the books I've read. So I'm very excited about that, and I really hope that 2021 will be just as good a year as 2020 in terms of books, and I hope it'll be a better year in terms of everything else. I haven't looked at many of my stats yet this year. I do usually like to make some pie charts with statistics for some aspects of my reading in a year, but I do know that about 80% of the books I read this year were written by women, which is not something I deliberately strived for, it's just something that happened. It seems that most of the books I read and most of the books on my shelves, I think, are written by women. And of course I knew that most of the books I was reading were written by women, but I didn't know there was this big of a difference. Also, in this top 10 there are 9 books by women and 1 book by a man, so that's interesting as well. But that's it for the stats for this year. I've compiled a list of 10 of my favorite books. The first 2 are my 2 absolute favorite books of the year, and the other 8 are books I really liked as well. I gave all of them 5 stars on Goodreads, but there isn't a clear order to them in this list, apart from the first 2. Also, I had a very difficult time with coming up with these 10. For the longest time, I had 11 books on here, but I didn't want to make it a top 11 because that's just a strange number. So in the end, with pain in my heart, I had to cut 1 book off the list, but I did include it in my honorable mentions, which will be at the end of the video. But without further ado, let's get into my 10 favorite books of 2020. The first book on this list probably won't be a big surprise to you if you've been watching my channel for a long time, and that is A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly. I read this book in May as part of a project I did for which I read books that my friends and family recommended to me, and this book was recommended to me by my father, which is also why I don't have a physical copy of it yet, because I borrowed his copy and I still haven't bought my own, which I really should because I really want to have this book on my shelves. A Different Drummer is a book about race and racism. It was written in 1962, but it is set in 1957 in a fictional town in a fictional state in the south of the USA. I think it's between Alabama and Mississippi. The story centers around Tucker Caliban, who is a black man who owns a farm in this fictional town, but one day he kills his livestock, he sets fire to his house, and then he just ups and leaves the state. And this is kind of the first sign or signal for all of the other black inhabitants of this state to leave the state as well. They just pack up their stuff and leave. It's a true exodus, and it leaves the white population of this state, but more specifically of this town where Tucker Caliban lived, completely baffled. The book deals with the aftermath of this exodus, and it is told through multiple perspectives by mostly white people in this town, I think. And through these perspectives we get to know more about Tucker Caliban, we get to know more about the history of this town, the history of its racism, and it was just a very impactful book. William Melvin Kelly himself was a black man and he was very political in his writing. I think he got more political as time went on, which is also why he was kind of forgotten and why no one wanted to publish or read him anymore after a certain point. But William Melvin Kelly in this book have been described as the lost giant of American literature, and I can totally see why, because this book was absolutely phenomenal. I really urge everyone to read it because it's beautifully written. I was blown away by the writing style. It is structured absolutely magnificently. Everything about this book feels perfect and feels very well thought through and deliberate. The story is very small in that it is set in this one town, but it also feels very large because it says something about race and racism and black people and white people and America as a whole. It takes on mythical proportions because of this exodus, and it was the best book I read this year, I think. The second book on this list is my other absolute favorite of the year, and this probably will be one of my new all-time favorite books. This one feels a bit more personal than A Different Drummer did, because I think A Different Drummer is objectively an incredibly good book and should be a classic, and this book I'm showing you now, Words in Deep Blue by Kath Crowley, is a bit more personal in why I like it. It is a very good book, but I don't think it's as big or important as A Different Drummer. Words Indeed Blue is a young adult contemporary novel set in Australia, and it tells the story of Rachel and Henry. They used to be best friends when they were younger, but then Rachel and her family moved away from the town they lived in before, and through a misunderstanding she no longer had any contact with Henry. But then after their graduation, Rachel moves back to the city while she's dealing with a lot of grief because her younger brother has passed away, and she meets Henry again, and they build up a new relationship again as they work together in Henry's family's bookstore, which is a wonderful setting for a book, of course. And this bookstore felt especially special to me, and the story is a story of love and grief, of death, of life, of friendship and family, and it just resonated with me in a very special way. The book said some things that I've felt myself before, and I didn't really know that anybody felt as well. Of course, I know that everything I'm feeling has been felt before, and a lot of people feel the same things without ever talking about it, but it was really beautiful to see it in a book, especially thoughts on death. After I finished this, I just knew it was a new favorite book, and I also knew that I wanted to kind of keep it to myself. Usually when I read a very good book, I urge my mother to read it, especially with young adult novels, because she really enjoys them as well. I immediately push the book to her and say, you should read this. But with this, for some reason, I kind of just wanted it for myself, and I really want to reread it again already. So now we're getting into the other 8 books that weren't my absolute favorite, but were still books that I really loved this year. The first book on that list is Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiefvater. This was the very first book I finished in 2020, and it feels like 2 years ago. 2020 has really gone on so long. So much has happened since I finished this book. When I read this, I didn't know about what was going to happen yet. That feels very weird. It also means that I kind of forgotten a lot of this book. I know I really loved it, but I think I'm going to have to reread it before the second book comes out in May, I think, May of 2021. Because this is the first book in a new trilogy by Maggie Stiefvater, the Dreamer trilogy, and it follows Ronan, who was an important character in Maggie Stiefvater's Raven cycle as well. It follows him along with his 2 brothers and a couple of new characters. And I really enjoyed diving into a story about a character I already knew, but getting to know him better, as well as getting to know more characters in this universe. It felt very familiar because I knew some of these characters from the Raven cycle, which is one of my all-time favorite series, but it also felt very new because this kind of feels like the Raven cycle on steroids. It's just everything is amped up a lot. The dreams, the stakes, it's just great. Like I said, I've forgotten a lot about this book, so I can't really relate to the plot to you, also because I don't want to give any spoilers. But it's about dreams and dreamers, which is always something I'm really interested in. Ronan has a special ability, which means that he can take stuff from his dreams to the actual world, and that makes him special but also dangerous. And that's kind of what this book is about. It's also about family and friendship and fake paintings and lots of other things. And I really can't wait to read the second book because I love Maggie Stiefvater, I love this trilogy. Her writing is always exquisite, it's unlike anything I've read before. I really can't compare it to any other author, but I really love it. So now I'm gonna kind of cheat because the next spot in this top 10 is taken up by 2 books, but they're 2 books in a series, so I figured it kind of worked. And they're A Closed and Common Orbit and Record of a Spaceborne View by Becky Chambers. These are books 2 and 3 in the Wayfarers trilogy, the first book of which is A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which was my favorite book of 2020. So I kind of knew or expected that I was going to love these 2 books as well. And I was right, because now this series is one of my all-time favorite series. I adore it, and I was very happy to find out that a 4th book is coming out in, I think, February. I don't have the books here with me because I lent them to a friend who really wanted to read them as well, which is of course always something I encourage with my favorite books. The Wayfarer series is a sci-fi series of companion novels, which means that these books are set in the same universe, but they're set on different planets or in different places and are all focusing on different characters, which is something I really enjoy because this universe is so rich and so expansive that I love getting to know more places within it and more characters, more different types of people, more alien races. And if it just focused on one group of characters, you're restricted to certain parts of this universe, and I just really love the fact that we get to know so much of it. And I don't know how many more books in this series there are going to be, but it feels like there's a very big potential for more stories and more books, and I would read them all, devour them all, and love them all. These stories are also very inclusive and diverse, which is something I really love, and they're relatively slow stories as they focus more on characters than on the plot, but I really enjoy that because I enjoy diving into character development and getting to know more about these people instead of focusing on a fast-paced action plot. But that is good to know for other people, I think, because I know some people prefer action-packed plots, especially in sci-fi. Next up is another book I don't have with me because it's also with a friend who wanted to read it, and that is On a Sunbeam by Tillie Walden. This is another sci-fi book, but it's a graphic novel. It's one of the most beautiful graphic novels I have ever read, I think. It's set in space and follows a crew of people who rebuild beautiful and broken down structures, and we follow Mia as she joins this crew and she learns their craft, and they travel through space repairing these structures. And as this storyline is progressing, we also get to know more about Mia's past in a boarding school through flashbacks where she meets another student and they fall in love with each other, and it's kind of their love story as well. Also, fun fact, there are no men in this story. All the characters are female, and there's one non-binary character, I think. And this was just such an immersive story, and the art style was really beautiful. I love the colors. I'm a bit sad that I can't show it to you right now because I don't have the book with me, but you'll just have to take my word for it. It's beautiful, the story was beautiful. It's something that I hadn't seen in a graphic novel before, this type of story, this ambitious story. It's also a very big book. So yeah, I was blown away by it. Next up is Circe by Madeline Miller, which tells the story of Circe, who is an enchantress from Greek mythology. She is the daughter of the sun god Helios, and we follow her from childhood as she lives in her father's court, but she doesn't belong and she's bullied by her brothers and sisters, and no one is ever really nice to her because Greek gods are assholes generally. And when she's older, her father kicks her out and she is forced to live in exile on an island, and we follow her there as she builds a life for herself and becomes this very strong, beautiful character. This is a deeply feminist story, I think. I was rooting for Circe all the way. She's definitely one of my favorite characters I've read about this year. I fell in love with her because of how strong she is, how fierce, and how she doesn't take any shit. And I love the writing in this. It's very beautiful. I know some people thought it was slow, but I, like I said before, enjoy slow stories that focus on character more than on plot. And I was deeply invested. I loved this from the get-go, and I knew very early on that this was going to be a 5-star read for me. Next up, we've got The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which was my most anticipated release for 2020, and I think probably the most popular book on this list. This book has been everywhere after it came out in October, I think, and deservedly so, I think, because I absolutely adored this book. This is a story about Addie LaRue, who in the 18th century, I think, makes a deal with a devil-type figure to live forever. Only what she doesn't know when she's making the deal is that she will be cursed to be forgotten by everyone she meets, including her own family. So she is destined to live a very long but also a very lonely life. And we follow her in the present day, 2014 I think, and we also get flashbacks from her life ever since she's made the deal. So we basically follow her throughout her whole life with a focus on the present. And the story really takes off when she meets Henry, who mysteriously does remember her after meeting her. And I absolutely love this story. The writing is beautiful. I really enjoyed hopping back and forth between Addie's present and her past. I really enjoyed her relationship with Henry. I thought the exploration of life and death was really good. That really resonated with me, and I was very invested in these characters as well. Like I said, it was my most anticipated release of 2020, and it was everything I was hoping it to be and more, I think. Definite 5-star read. The next book on this list is Nevermoor by Jessica Townsend. This is a middle grade fantasy story about a little girl called Morrigan Crow, who is cursed and destined to die on her 11th birthday. But then when that 11th birthday rolls around, she is whisked away to a magical city called Nevermoor by a wonderfully strange man called Jupiter North. And in Nevermoor, Morrigan joins a competition to join the Wondrous Society, which means she has to enter a bunch of trials, which are usually scary and often dangerous as well. And I absolutely love this book. It gave me all the warm and fuzzy feelings that a certain book about a boy wizard used to do before we found out that its author was an awful human being. And I noticed getting that feeling again while reading this, and it had been a very long time since I experienced that. Just that feeling of wonder and loving the magic and loving the story, just being so invested in this wonderful children's story. It just made me very happy to find that again. And I'm very excited to read the second book, which I've already got on my shelves and which will definitely be the first book I pick up in 2021. We're down to the last two books now, and the 9th book is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read this in November, and I wanted to read it so I could watch the Netflix film, but I just remembered that I still haven't watched the Netflix film. I've simply forgotten about that, even though I really love the book. It's in my top 10 after all. But this is a modern classic about a young, often naive, nameless narrator who marries an older widower called Maxim de Winter, and she moves back to his gloomy, imposing mansion with him called Manderley. Once she's there and she's kind of settled in Manderley, she finds out that the house still very much belongs to the deceased first wife of Maxim de Winter called Rebecca. And I wouldn't call this a thriller, but it's definitely thrilling at some points near the end. It's definitely a page turner as well. There's something about Daphne du Maurier's writing style that had me invested almost from the get-go, even though this does have a relatively slow start. Her writing is just so magnificent. It is very rich, but it doesn't get slow. It makes you want to turn the pages, it makes you want to read on. This book is just so well crafted and so well written. And the last book on this list is also the book I finished most recently. I only finished this last night, but I had a feeling that it was going to make this list, so I didn't want to make this video before finishing this book. And the book I'm talking about is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This won the Man Booker Prize last year, and ever since then I wanted to read it, but I didn't get around to it until now, which now I'm kicking myself for, because this is a magnificent book, a very clear 5-star read for me. The book tells the stories of 12 different people, most of them women, most of them black. And these are not necessarily all women who know each other. Some of them live in different times even. But they are all somehow connected, or at least in groups they are connected. And they are all living in Britain. So this really tells the story of people living in Britain who don't always necessarily fill the box that society wants them to fill. It covers things like classism, racism, misogynism, homophobia, all those important, sometimes heavy topics, but it does so in such a beautiful way. Sometimes a very painful way and sad way, but a necessary way as well, I think. None of the characters were entirely likable, and some of them weren't even likable at all, but that actually made me love the story more because it made it feel more real. These people felt like real people who were just doing what they needed to get by, and I really enjoyed that. Also, the writing is amazing. I did have to get used to the format a little bit because there are no quotation marks or periods in this book, or very little periods. There's just commas and enters. That takes some getting used to, but it wasn't as jarring as I thought it would be before going into it. I actually got used to it rather quickly, and it ended up being quite a nice way to read the book. And it made it feel quite poetic at times as well, which fit the story pretty well. I do want to mention a trigger warning for this book though, which is a trigger warning I would have appreciated before going into it, and that is that this book does deal with rape of an underage girl. So I think that's important to know before going into it. Nevertheless, I think this is an amazing book. I'm so glad it's getting the recognition it deserves, and I'm very glad that I've now finally read it. And that's it for my top 10 books of 2020. Like I said, there are a few honorable mentions, so I would like to quickly go through them now. The first one is the book that almost made the list and almost made me make this a top 11 because I couldn't choose, but I ended up cutting it anyway, and that was The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. This is the first Isabel Allende book I read. It was absolutely beautiful. I was blown away by it. It was wonderful, and I really want to read more of her books. The next two books I want to mention are two books that were a big surprise for me this year, and they are a duology. They are These Witches Don't Burn and This Coven Won't Break. When I went into the first book, These Witches Don't Burn, I figured it would just be a fun read, a palate cleanser so to speak. But then I ended up being really invested, really loving it. And I loved the second book as well. This was just such a fun read, and every time I see these books in my shelves, I just remember loving the reading experience so much. Then there's Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid, which is a debut novel, and I really want to read more by this author when she comes out with more books, because this was beautifully written, beautifully structured, a very important book about racism and intersectional feminism, and it was just great. Then there's Don't Date Rosa Santos by Nina Moreno, which is another one of those books that ended up being a surprise. I was expecting a fun YA contemporary novel, but it included magical realism elements. It had a lot of elements I traditionally love in books, like a small town setting, a book about family, a book that's set at the sea, and it reminded me of Jane the Virgin a lot as well, which is one of my favorite TV shows. I really like this, and I'd really like to reread it at some point. Next up we've got Dear Martin by Nick Stone, which is about a black boy in high school who starts to write letters to Martin Luther King because he feels angry at the injustice of racism in modern day society. He's an honor roll student, he always tries to do the best he can, and then he gets arrested for something he didn't do, and later on something even more heartbreaking happens. And this was just a very important book. I think I read it in one day. It's just so good, so important to read. I think this should be mandatory reading in high schools. And the last book I wanted to mention is The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, which actually made me cry. It's about an elderly couple who go in search of their forgotten son. It has Arthurian myth vibes, it is based on medieval storytelling. It's beautiful. And there we have it, those were my favorite books of 2020. I had an amazing reading year, like I said. I hope you had too. Please let me know down in the comments what your favorite book of 2020 was, or a few, if like me, you really can't choose between them. Please like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos in the next year, because this will be the last video of the year. And have a wonderful day and Happy New Year. Bye!